There is a place on this planet where most people will never go, not because it is dangerous exactly, not because it is impossible to reach, but because something about it has always felt off limits in a way that is hard to explain. Antarctica is the coldest, driest, most isolated continent on Earth. We know that much. We have maps, we have research stations, we have satellite images, and yet there are questions about that place that have never been answered cleanly. Treaties that restrict who can go, zones that nobody talks about. History that gets a little blurry when you look too closely. This is not a story about monsters under the ice. It is something quieter than that, more unsettling maybe, because it involves real governments, real decisions, and real silences that were chosen deliberately. We are going to take our time with this one. There is something about agreements made in quiet rooms that never quite sits right, not because the people in those rooms are necessarily hiding something, but because quiet rooms tend to produce quiet agreements, and quiet agreements tend to leave quiet gaps. And Antarctica, in many ways, began with exactly that kind of agreement. The year was 1959. The world was not a calm place. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a tension so thick you could almost feel it through the history books. Both sides were building weapons. Both sides were watching each other with suspicion, so deep it had become a kind of permanent background noise. Trust between these two powers was not just low, it was nearly non-existent. And yet, in December of that year, 12 nations sat down together and signed a document that said, essentially, Antarctica belongs to no one. It is a place of peace. It is a place of science. Nobody will put weapons there. Nobody will claim territory. And everybody will be allowed to observe everybody else's activities to make sure those rules are being followed. 12 nations, including the United States, including the Soviet Union. Just sit with that for a moment. These were two governments that could not agree on almost anything. Two governments that were, in a very real sense, preparing for the possibility of nuclear war. And they shook hands over a frozen continent at the bottom of the world and said, yes, this place we will share. This place we will protect together. Why? That is the question that does not get asked enough. Not what the treaty says. We can read what the treaty says. The question is why, in that particular moment, with that particular level of global hostility, did this particular agreement happen so smoothly? The Antarctic Treaty was the first arms control agreement of the Cold War era. That fact alone should make anyone pause. Before the two superpowers could agree on anything else, before any nuclear treaties, before any communication hotlines, before any diplomatic thaw, they agreed on Antarctica. And they did it fast. Negotiations began in 1958 and the treaty was signed in 1959. For Cold War diplomacy, that is remarkably quick. These were governments that could take years to agree on the wording of a single paragraph. The Antarctic Treaty covered an entire continent in roughly 12 months. The official explanation is that Antarctica had been the site of peaceful scientific cooperation during the International Geophysical Year, which ran from 1957 to 1958. That cooperation, the story goes, created goodwill, and that goodwill was formalized into a treaty. It is a reasonable explanation. It is not a complete one, because the International Geophysical Year was itself a strange moment. 12 nations sent researchers to Antarctica simultaneously. Multiple countries set up stations on the same continent at the same time. They shared some data. They worked near each other without conflict. And then almost immediately afterward, they decided that what had worked informally should be made permanent and legal. What were they all doing there in the first place? That question tends to get glossed over. The official answer is science, atmospheric research, glaciology, geomagnetic studies. And some of that work was absolutely genuine. The science produced during the IGY was real and significant. But all 12 nations, including military powers in the middle of an arms race, decided simultaneously that a remote, ice-covered continent at the bottom of the world needed their direct physical presence. Not satellite observation, not funded research from a distance, actual bases, actual people on the ground. That level of interest requires something more than pure scientific curiosity. There is another layer to this that most people never think about. The Antarctic Treaty did not just agree on peace. It froze territorial claims. Before the treaty, 7 nations had made official claims to Antarctic territory. Argentina, Australia, Chile, France, New Zealand, Norway, and the United Kingdom all had pieces of the continent they considered theirs. The United States and the Soviet Union had made no formal claims, but both had explicitly reserved the right to make them in the future. The treaty said, effectively, all of that is suspended, not canceled, suspended. The claims still exist in legal theory. They are just not being acted upon. Nobody can make new claims. Nobody can expand existing ones. And nobody has to give up what they already claimed. This is a very specific kind of legal arrangement. It does not resolve the question of who owns Antarctica. It just stops anyone from doing anything about that question, indefinitely. And the nations that had made claims agreed to this. They agreed to freeze their own territorial ambitions over a continent they had spent decades trying to stake out. Argentina and Chile, in particular, had overlapping claims that should have made cooperation between them on this extremely complicated. But they signed. Everyone signed. The treaty has been updated and expanded over the decades. The original 12 signatories have grown to over 50 nations. There is now a whole body of international agreements under what is called the Antarctic Treaty System. Rules about environmental protection, rules about tourism, rules about mineral extraction, which is currently banned. That last one is interesting. The ban on mineral extraction was added in 1991 in a protocol called the Madrid Protocol. It prohibits any mining or resource exploitation in Antarctica until at least 2048. At that point, a review can be requested. But any change to that ban requires unanimous agreement from all the consultative parties to the treaty. Unanimous. every nation with a meaningful stake in Antarctica would have to agree before anyone could start extracting resources. Why would that be the rule? Why not a majority vote or a supermajority? Why unanimous? One reading is that it was designed to protect Antarctica permanently, because getting unanimous agreement is nearly impossible. Another reading is that it was designed to ensure that when the time comes, no single powerful nation could be outvoted, that every major player would have a veto. That second reading is worth thinking about, because it assumes that the major players believe there is something in Antarctica worth having a veto over. The treaty also established something called the right of inspection. Any member nation can send observers to inspect any other nation's stations, facilities, or equipment at any time, with no advance notice required. This was genuinely unusual for international agreements, particularly during the Cold War. It was presented as a transparency measure. But here is the thing about inspection rights. They are only useful if you use them, and the inspection system, while it exists, has been used relatively rarely. There are reports filed, there are visits made, but the actual enforcement of what inspectors find has always been murky. Nations are expected to comply with the treaty's terms, but the treaty has no enforcement mechanism with real teeth. So what you have is an agreement that says everyone can see what everyone else is doing, but relies entirely on trust and diplomatic pressure to actually work. Which means, in practice, that if a nation wanted to do something quietly, in the right location, the inspection system would only catch it if another nation decided to send observers specifically to that location at that time. Antarctica is the size of the United States and Mexico combined. That is a lot of ice to inspect. The original treaty was signed to last for 30 years, with a review possible after that. The review happened. The treaty was strengthened, not weakened. Nobody left. Nobody challenged the fundamental structure. There is a version of this story where the Antarctic Treaty is simply one of humanity's most successful acts of international cooperation. A genuine example of nations choosing peace over competition, science over militarism, shared stewardship over territorial greed. That version might even be true. But it does not explain the speed. It does not explain the unanimity. It does not explain why two superpowers who agreed on almost nothing else agreed on this first, and agreed on it quickly. It does not explain why the nations with territorial claims were willing to freeze those claims indefinitely over a continent that was already being described, in the same breath, as potentially rich in mineral and energy resources. People do not give up resources without a reason. Governments especially do not give up resources without a reason. So what was the reason? One possibility that researchers and historians have explored is that something was found during the IGY, not something dramatic necessarily, but something significant enough that all the parties involved understood the value of keeping things calm, keeping things controlled, and keeping the public conversation focused on science rather than whatever else was happening down there. This is not a claim. It is a question that the historical record does not cleanly answer. What we know is this. In 1959, 12 of the world's most competitive and suspicious governments looked at Antarctica and decided together that the best thing for all of them was to share it, to restrict it, and to make sure no single party could dominate it. That kind of agreement usually happens when there is something to protect, or something to contain, or something that everyone has decided quietly should not belong to any one of them alone. What that something might be is what the rest of this story is going to try to sit with, not answer necessarily, but sit with, because sometimes the question is the thing that matters. And the Antarctic Treaty, read carefully and slowly, is full of questions that were never meant to be asked out loud. Before we get into what happened, it helps to understand the scale of what was sent down there. Because when most people hear the phrase military expedition, they picture something modest, a few ships, a few hundred men, some equipment, a flag maybe. Operation High Jump was not that. What the United States Navy deployed to Antarctica in 1946 was, by any reasonable measure, a small invasion force. 13 ships, 33 aircraft, nearly 5,000 men. The operation was led by Rear Admiral Richard Evelyn Bayard, who was at that point one of the most celebrated explorers in American history. He had been to Antarctica before. He had mapped it, studied it, wintered there alone. He knew that continent better than almost any living person, and yet the military sent 5,000 men with him. The official stated purpose of Operation High Jump was to establish a research base, to train military personnel in cold weather operations, to test equipment in extreme conditions, and to consolidate American presence in Antarctica through aerial mapping. All of that sounds reasonable on the surface. Cold War logic applied to a remote continent. Get there, show presence, map the territory. But the scale does not match the stated mission. You do not need 5,000 men and 13 ships to set up a research base and take aerial photographs. The logistics of feeding, housing, and managing that many people in one of the most hostile environments on Earth would itself be an enormous undertaking. The cost alone would have been significant, and this was 1946, less than a year after the end of World War II. The United States military had just come through the most resource-intensive conflict in human history. Resources were not unlimited, so why that many people? Why that much hardware? The operation was approved at the highest levels. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal authorized it. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were involved. This was not a small bureaucratic decision. It was a major military deployment, treated with the seriousness of a wartime operation. They departed in December 1946 and arrived in Antarctic waters in January 1947. The plan was for the operation to run until approximately March 1947, 3 months of work, mapping, training, establishing presence. They left in February, a month early. No complete official explanation was ever given for why the operation ended ahead of schedule. The reports that were filed cited weather conditions. But Antarctic weather in February, while difficult, was not unusually severe that year by historical standards. Weather had been factored into the planning from the beginning. Pulling 5,000 men and 13 ships out of position a month ahead of schedule because of weather, in a mission that had been planned specifically around Antarctic conditions, does not fully add up. Something happened that changed the timeline. We do not know with certainty what it was. What we do know is what Admiral Bayard said afterward. And what Bayard said is the part of this story that most official histories tend to move past quickly. In a press conference shortly after returning, Bayard made a statement that is worth reading carefully. He said that in the case of a new war, the United States could be attacked by aircraft flying over one or both poles. He spoke specifically about the threat of enemy aircraft appearing from directions that Americans had not traditionally thought of as threat vectors. He described the polar regions as strategically critical in a way that suggested he had come to that conclusion through direct experience, not theoretical projection. This was unusual for a military man of Bayard's standing. The officers in that era, particularly those involved in sensitive operations, tended to say very little in public. They gave prepared statements. They thanked their crews. They talked about scientific achievements. They did not typically make open-ended warnings about new categories of military threat without some concrete basis for those warnings. Bayard had seen something, or experienced something, that made him feel it was important to say this publicly, even in vague terms. Later, in a 1954 interview with a Chilean newspaper, Bayard reportedly went further. He described Antarctica as a continent of mystery. He spoke about the need for the world to pay attention to what was happening there. He reportedly used language that suggested he believed the situation in Antarctica was more complex and more serious than the public understood. Some of these later quotes have been disputed in terms of exact wording, translation issues, sourcing questions, the usual complications that come with historical documentation. But the broad shape of what Bayard communicated in his later years is consistent. He believed Antarctica mattered in a way that went beyond science. And he believed the public was not being told everything. Bayard died in 1957. He never gave a full accounting of what he saw or experienced during high jump. His personal diaries from that period have been referenced by researchers, but have never been fully released to the public. The portions that have been made available are largely logistical: weather reports, navigation notes, supply inventories, the kind of material that tells you where a person was, not what they were thinking. Now, there is a theory about Operation High Jump that goes significantly further than anything in the documented record. It involves Nazi Germany, hidden bases, and technology that should not have existed. We will come to some of that in the next chapter, because the Nazi connection to Antarctica is its own thread, and it deserves its own space. But even setting that theory entirely aside, the documented facts of high jump are strange enough on their own. 5,000 men, 13 ships, 33 aircraft. a mission that ended a month early with no complete explanation. An admiral who came home and started making public statements about new kinds of military threats from directions nobody had considered. Personal records that have never been fully released. Official reports that answer some questions and leave others entirely untouched. There were also reports from crew members, not official reports. Personal accounts, letters home, the kind of informal documentation that military historians sometimes find decades later when someone's family donates a box of papers. Some of those accounts describe seeing things that were not in the mission briefings, aircraft that did not match any known design. Lights beneath the water that should not have been there, equipment failures that had no mechanical explanation. These accounts are scattered and informal. They cannot be verified with certainty. But they exist in enough number, from enough different crew members, in enough different forms, that dismissing them entirely requires a kind of deliberate effort. What is also documented is that after high jump, the United States returned to Antarctica. In 1955, a follow-up operation called Deep Freeze was launched, and it has never really stopped. American military presence in Antarctica, under various names and justifications, has been continuous from that point forward. The research stations established under Deep Freeze are still operating. McMurdo Station, which began as part of that effort, is today the largest research station on the continent. The transition from Operation High Jump to Operation Deep Freeze is interesting. High Jump was explicitly a naval military operation. Deep Freeze was framed as a scientific and logistical support mission. The language changed. The framing changed. The presence did not. Whatever High Jump found or did not find was significant enough to justify a permanent American foothold on the continent. That foothold has been maintained, funded, and staffed without interruption for nearly 70 years. There is also the question of what other nations were doing at the same time, because high jump did not happen in isolation. The Soviet Union was watching. Britain was watching. Argentina and Chile, who had their own territorial claims in the region, were watching. The level of international attention paid to what was officially described as a scientific training exercise was itself notable. When the Soviets eventually established their own Antarctic presence, they positioned their main station, Vostok, in the most geographically remote location on the continent. Not on the coast, where logistics would be simpler, but deep in the interior, in a spot that offered almost no practical advantage for most kinds of research, but which sat directly above one of the most unusual geographic features on the continent. That feature, which is a subglacial lake sealed under kilometers of ice, is something we will spend real time on later. The point for now is that the Soviets did not choose that location randomly. And the Americans, for their part, chose locations that gave them the broadest possible coverage of the continent's terrain. Neither superpower was in Antarctica purely for weather data. Bayard knew that. Whatever else he saw or experienced down there, he understood that the continent was already a theater of strategic interest. even if the public conversation kept using the language of science. His warnings about polar threats were not the words of a man describing an abstract possibility. They were the words of someone who had gone somewhere and come back changed. He never said changed exactly, but you can hear it in the shape of what he chose to say and what he chose not to say, the careful vagueness. The references to things the public did not understand, the way he kept returning to Antarctica in his thoughts and his statements even years after his last visit. There is a version of the Operation Highjump story that is entirely conventional. A military operation that was planned too ambitiously, cut short by logistics and weather, followed by the kind of vague public statements that military men of that era sometimes made when they were processing difficult experiences. A great explorer who had seen extraordinary things and struggled in his later years to communicate their significance. That version is possible. It just does not explain why 5,000 men were sent in the first place, and it does not explain why they came home early. And it does not explain why Bayard, one of the most disciplined and precise communicators in American military history, chose to end his public statements about Antarctica on a note of unresolved warning. He saw something, or he was told something, or both. And whatever it was enough to make a man who had survived solo Antarctic winters, who had flown over the South Pole, who had mapped more of that continent than any other American, come home and quietly tell the world to pay attention. Most of the world did not. This is the chapter that is easiest to dismiss, and that dismissal is in some ways understandable, because the moment you say Nazis and Antarctica in the same sentence, the imagination goes to certain places, underground bases, flying saucers. The Fourth Reich waiting beneath the ice. The imagery is so extreme that it tends to discredit everything around it, including the parts that are genuinely documented. So let us start with what is actually in the historical record, and then we can talk about where the record gets thin. In 1938, Nazi Germany launched an expedition to Antarctica. This is not disputed. It is in German archives. It was reported in the international press at the time. The expedition was organized under the authority of Hermann Göring, who headed the Reich Aviation Ministry, and it was led by a captain named Alfred Richer. The ship was called the Schwabenland, named after a region of Germany, and it carried a crew of researchers, scientists, and military personnel. The expedition's stated purpose was to scout territory for a German whaling operation. Germany needed whale oil for margarine and other food products, and the Antarctic waters were among the richest whaling grounds on Earth. Finding and claiming territory that could support a German whaling base was a legitimate economic interest. But the expedition did significantly more than scout for whales. The Schwabenland carried 2 seaplanes, which were launched from the ship's catapults and flew reconnaissance missions over a large section of the Antarctic interior. During those flights, the crew dropped thousands of small metal stakes bearing the Nazi swastika. These stakes were meant to mark German territorial claims. The territory they claimed, a stretch of coastline and interior land, was named Neuschwabenland, New Swabia. Germany was formally claiming a piece of Antarctica. They mapped roughly 600,000 square kilometers of territory. They documented ice-free areas, geothermal features, and inland lakes. They were thorough. This was not a casual scouting trip. It was a systematic survey conducted with military precision. Then the war started. And the public record of what Germany did with that information becomes significantly murkier. During the war, German U-boats operated extensively in the South Atlantic. Their range was considerable, and their operations in that part of the ocean have never been fully mapped by any open historical source. Some researchers have documented supply runs and refueling operations in remote locations. Whether any of those operations extended to Antarctic waters is something the historical record does not clearly confirm or deny. What is documented is the post-war period, and the post-war period is where things get genuinely strange. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Allied forces moved through Germany, capturing personnel, seizing documents, and trying to account for the leadership of the Nazi regime. Most of the major figures were captured, tried at Nuremberg, and either executed or imprisoned. But a significant number of others disappeared. The escape routes used by Nazi war criminals after the war are historically documented. They are not a conspiracy theory. They are called ratlins, a term that was used at the time, and they were real, organized networks that helped Nazi personnel move through Europe to ports, and from ports to new countries. The Vatican was involved, to a degree that the Catholic Church has since partially acknowledged. Certain intelligence agencies, including elements of American and British intelligence, helped some Nazi scientists and operatives escape in exchange for technical knowledge or future cooperation. The most documented destination was South America. Argentina, in particular, under President Juan Perón, accepted a significant number of Nazi refugees. Some estimates put the number in the thousands. These were not all minor figures. Adolf Eichmann, one of the primary architects of the Holocaust, was living in Argentina under a false name until Israeli intelligence agents captured him in 1960. Joseph Mengele, the concentration camp doctor whose experiments on prisoners remain among the most documented atrocities of the Nazi regime, also fled to South America. He was never captured. He died in Brazil in 1979. These are not fringe claims. These are established historical facts. The ratlins existed. They worked. Senior Nazi figures used them to reach South America, and South America sheltered them, sometimes for decades. Now, Argentina is not Antarctica. And this is where the documented history begins to thin out and the questions become harder to answer cleanly. What is known is this. Argentina was one of the nations with a territorial claim in Antarctica. Argentina had Nazi refugees living within its borders. Argentina was, during the late 1940s, governed by a regime that was openly sympathetic to fascism and had maintained neutrality during most of the war. And Argentina was one of the signatories to the Antarctic Treaty in 1959. The geographic connection between Argentina and Antarctica is also real. The Argentine city of Ushuaia, in Tierra del Fuego, is the southernmost city in the world and one of the closest human settlements to the Antarctic continent. It has historically been a departure point for Antarctic expeditions. Whether any Nazi personnel actually reached Antarctica, and if so what they did there, is something the historical record does not confirm. What exists are claims, some of them coming from post-war German sources, some from Allied intelligence reports, some from the kinds of informal testimony that are difficult to verify but equally difficult to completely discount. One of the more persistent claims involves a U-boat that surrendered to Argentine authorities in July 1945, several months after the German surrender. The submarine was the U-530. Its commander, Otto Wermuth, surrendered the boat in Mar del Plata, Argentina. He claimed he had been at sea since before the German surrender and had simply not received orders in time to surrender earlier. A second submarine, the U-977, surrendered at the same port several months later, in August 1945. Its commander, Heinz Schäfer, gave a similar explanation. Both submarines were found to be carrying no cargo when they surrendered. Both had been at sea for unusually long periods after the German defeat. Both commanders were interrogated by Allied intelligence, including American naval intelligence, and both were eventually released. The interrogation records have been partially declassified. What the submarines were doing during those months at sea was never fully established. Schäfer later wrote a memoir in which he described his journey, but denied any involvement in transporting Nazi leadership or materials. The American intelligence at the time reportedly believed one of the submarines may have been involved in transporting something or someone of significance, but no definitive conclusion was ever made public. Here is what makes this harder to dismiss than it might seem. The American military intelligence in the post-war period was genuinely concerned about the possibility that Nazi technology, personnel, or assets had been moved to a location that was outside Allied reach. This concern was serious enough to generate actual intelligence operations. It was not fringe speculation. It was a documented anxiety within the Allied intelligence community, and Antarctica in 1945 was outside Allied reach. It was outside everyone's reach, practically speaking. There were no permanent stations there. There was no regular monitoring. A submarine could reach the Antarctic coast, offload personnel or equipment, and return without any realistic chance of detection. Whether that happened is not something we can say with certainty. What we can say is that Operation Highjump, which we talked about in the last chapter, launched less than 2 years after the German surrender. 5,000 American military personnel sent to a continent that had no established threat, no known enemy presence, and no strategic military value under its stated justification, deployed with the scale and urgency of a wartime operation. The timing is suggestive. it does not prove anything. But it is the kind of timing that, when you know what came before it, does not feel coincidental. There is one more piece of this that deserves attention. After Operation High Jump ended, there was a period of approximately 8 years before the United States returned in force with Operation Deep Freeze. During that period, other nations, including Argentina and Britain, maintained a presence in the Antarctic region. Some of that activity was documented, some of it was not. In 1947, a British operation called Tabarin, which had begun during the war as a secret mission to deny Antarctic territory to the Germans and Argentines, was formalized into the Falkland Islands Dependency Survey. Britain was maintaining a quiet but persistent foothold in the same general region. Why had Tabarin begun during the war specifically? The official explanation was to prevent enemy use of Antarctic territory as a naval base. That explanation implies a real concern that someone, presumably Germany, had plans for that territory. Plans significant enough that Britain felt it necessary to send personnel to Antarctica in the middle of a world war. The Nazis looked at Antarctica, they mapped it, they claimed it, they sent U-boats into those waters. Whether they built anything there, whether they left anyone there, whether the escape routes that worked so well through South America extended any further south, is something that has never been fully answered. What has been answered is that the countries that defeated Germany did not simply move on. They went to Antarctica themselves, quickly, in force, and they have stayed. If there was nothing there, if the German interest in Antarctica was purely about whale oil and territorial prestige, then the post-war response from multiple major military powers seems disproportionate. You do not send 5,000 men to look for a whaling station that was never built, but if there was something there, something that needed to be found or contained or assessed, then the response makes a different kind of sense. What that something might have been, we cannot say for certain. The historical record gives us outlines without centers, shadows without sources, the shape of a story whose most important details were either never written down or were written down somewhere that no one has yet been allowed to look. Most people, when they think about restricted airspace, think about cities, military bases, nuclear facilities, the kind of places where you can understand intuitively why a government would want to control what flies overhead. The logic is obvious. The infrastructure is visible. There is something there worth protecting. Antarctica does not have cities. It does not have nuclear reactors, at least not officially, and not anymore. The one small nuclear power plant that the United States operated at McMurdo Station was removed in the 1970s after contamination issues. There are research stations, yes, scattered across a continent the size of 2 large countries, but research stations, as a general category, do not typically generate the kind of airspace restrictions that have been quietly associated with certain parts of Antarctica over the decades. And yet, the airspace situation over Antarctica is more complicated than most people realize. and the complications are not always the ones that get explained. Start with the basics. Antarctica is covered by what aviation authorities call special use airspace designations. Some of this is genuinely practical. The continent sits at the bottom of the Earth, which creates navigation challenges related to magnetic compasses, which stop functioning reliably near the poles because the magnetic field lines run nearly vertical there. GPS coverage in polar regions has historically been less complete than at lower latitudes, though this has improved. Weather systems in Antarctica are severe and unpredictable in ways that make route planning difficult. These are real issues. They explain why civilian commercial aviation does not routinely fly over Antarctica the way it flies over the Arctic. But practical navigation challenges do not explain everything. There is a phenomenon that frequent flyers sometimes notice when they look at flight path maps. Flights between certain city pairs, particularly in the southern hemisphere, take routes that appear on a standard map to be significantly longer than the most direct path. A flight from Sydney to Johannesburg, for instance, or from Santiago to Perth, follows routes that curve away from Antarctica rather than toward it. The explanation usually given involves the jet stream, prevailing winds, and fuel efficiency. These factors are real and they do influence routing decisions. What is less often discussed is that some of those routing decisions hold even when wind conditions would make a more southerly route equally efficient or faster. Pilots and aviation professionals who have looked at this have noted that certain southern latitude waypoints simply do not appear in standard commercial routing systems. They are not there as options. The software does not offer them. This could be a legacy of older navigation limitations that was never updated as technology improved. That is a reasonable explanation. It is also the kind of explanation that is hard to verify or disprove from the outside. What is more directly documented is the history of specific flight restrictions around Antarctic research zones. McMurdo Station, the American facility, operates its own airspace management for the region around it. The coordination required to fly into or out of McMurdo is substantial. This is partly logistics, partly weather. But the airspace around McMurdo and several other major stations includes buffers that extend beyond what you would expect for purely practical reasons. There are also specific zones that appear in aviation charts as restricted or advisory areas without detailed public justification. Some of these zones correspond to known research station locations. Some of them do not correspond to any publicly listed facility. In 2016, a pilot named Daniel Landau attempted to conduct a private flight through Antarctic airspace along a route that would have passed over several areas not typically included in tourist or expedition flight paths. The attempt was not completed. The restrictions he encountered were not fully explained in any public documentation he was able to access. His account of the experience, shared in aviation forums and later in a longer written piece, describes a process of encountering bureaucratic barriers that were real but not fully transparent about their underlying justification. His case is not unique. Expedition pilots who operate in Antarctica regularly describe a tiered system of access that goes beyond what the public treaty framework would suggest. There are zones where you can fly, zones where you need specific authorization, and zones where authorization is either not available or not acknowledged as a category. The zones where authorization is not acknowledged are the interesting ones. There are coordinates in Antarctica that appear in unofficial records, in the notes of researchers, in the accounts of expedition staff, that seem to correspond to areas of unusual restriction, not dangerous weather systems, not known military facilities. Just areas where access has been quietly discouraged or denied without a complete public explanation. Google Earth has become an unexpected resource for people trying to examine Antarctic geography from a distance. Satellite imagery of Antarctica is available through that platform, and researchers and curious observers have spent considerable time examining it. Some of what they have found has been clearly explicable. Ice formations, research station infrastructure, supply routes. Some of it has been less explicable. There are locations in Antarctic satellite imagery that show blurring, pixelation, or what appears to be deliberate image alteration. Some of these have been explained as artifacts of the imaging process, problems with how satellite imagery handles extreme reflectivity from snow and ice, or stitching errors from combining multiple image passes. These explanations are technically valid for some cases. For other cases, the alterations appear in ways that do not match the expected patterns of imaging artifacts. The shapes are too regular. The placement is too specific. And in at least several documented instances, imagery that was available at one point was later replaced with altered versions that obscured features visible in the earlier images. The coordinates involved in some of these cases have been shared and examined by independent researchers. A few of them correspond to areas of Antarctica that have no publicly listed research facilities and no obvious geographic reason for special attention. Now, there is a significant caveat here. Satellite imagery platforms like Google Earth use imagery from multiple sources, acquired at different times, processed through multiple systems. Inconsistencies in that imagery are genuinely common and genuinely often explicable through technical means. Being careful about this matters. Not every blurred pixel is a hidden secret. But the pattern across multiple locations, multiple time periods, and multiple independent observers noting the same anomalies at the same coordinates suggests something worth examining. There is also the matter of tourist flights. Antarctic tourism has grown considerably over the past few decades. Cruise ships operate in Antarctic waters. Overflights where passengers fly to Antarctica and circle without landing have been offered commercially. The industry is regulated through the International Association of Antarctica Tour Operators, which works within the framework of the Antarctic Treaty System. The areas accessible to tourists, both by ship and by air, are defined. They are not secret, but they are notably limited relative to the full geography of the continent. The tourism framework essentially channels visitors towards specific coastal areas and away from the interior and from certain sections of the coastline. This is framed as environmental protection. Antarctica is a fragile ecosystem, and limiting human traffic in sensitive areas is a legitimate conservation concern. The Madrid Protocol explicitly addresses this. Designated protected areas exist, but the protected areas and the restricted areas are not always the same zones. And the zones that are restricted in ways that go beyond environmental protection are the ones that do not have complete public explanations attached to them. There was an incident in the early 2000s, documented in aviation safety reports, involving an aircraft operating in support of a research mission that encountered what the crew described as unexplained electromagnetic interference over a specific inland region. The interference affected navigation instruments in ways that were inconsistent with the known electromagnetic environment at that location. The report was filed. It was reviewed. The official response described the incident as likely related to geomagnetic anomalies in the Antarctic interior, which are real and documented phenomena. What the report did not address was why the interference pattern matched what you would expect from an active signal source rather than a passive geomagnetic anomaly. Active signal sources generate interference with specific characteristics. Passive geomagnetic anomalies generate different characteristics. The crew's description, read carefully, fits the former more than the latter. One report, possibly explainable, not proof of anything, but filed alongside the routing anomalies, the imagery alterations, the undefined restricted zones, and the accounts of pilots encountering bureaucratic restrictions without clear justification. It contributes to a picture that is at least worth examining. What is also worth noting is that the nations with the largest and most sophisticated research presences in Antarctica, the United States, Russia, and increasingly China, all operate facilities in the interior of the continent, away from the coasts where most monitoring and observation naturally concentrates. The interior is where logistics are hardest. It is also where visibility from outside is lowest. China's expansion in Antarctica over the past 15 years has been notable. New stations, new infrastructure, new investment in Antarctic logistics capability. Chinese researchers have made significant scientific contributions through their Antarctic program. But the scale and pace of China's buildup has been observed with interest by other nations, and some of the locations chosen for Chinese facilities sit in areas that are strategically positioned relative to the continent's interior. When multiple major powers independently choose to place infrastructure in the most remote, least observable parts of a continent, and when the airspace above those areas is subject to restrictions that exceed what public agreements require, the simplest explanation is not always the most satisfying one. Antarctica is large enough to hide things. The question is not really whether things are being hidden. The question is what kind of things and by whom, and whether the hiding is coordinated or simply parallel, each nation keeping its own secrets in the same silent place. The no-fly zones do not prove anything, neither does the imagery, neither does the single electromagnetic interference report. But when you stand back from the individual pieces and look at the overall pattern, what you see is a continent where the gap between public access and actual activity is larger than it should be if everything happening there is purely scientific. And that gap, that quiet space between what is acknowledged and what is done, is where the most interesting questions tend to live. Let me be clear about something before we go any further. The hollow Earth theory, as a literal physical description of our planet, is not supported by science. The Earth is not hollow. We know this through seismic data, through the behavior of earthquake waves as they travel through the planet's interior, through gravitational measurements, through everything we understand about planetary formation. The Earth has a crust, a mantle, an outer core, and an inner core. It is dense and layered and solid in the ways that matter. That is not what this chapter is about. What this chapter is about is why the hollow Earth idea keeps appearing in connection with Antarctica, specifically why serious people, including military figures and credentialed scientists, entertained versions of it for longer than the history books tend to acknowledge, and what the real geographic and geological features of Antarctica might have contributed to keeping that idea alive, because the hollow Earth theory did not begin as a fringe belief. It began as a serious scientific hypothesis proposed by a credible scientist, and it was taken seriously by the established scientific community for a period of time that might surprise you. The man who formalized the theory in its most influential version was an American named John Cleves Sims Jr. He was a veteran of the War of 1812, a respectable figure by the standards of his time, and in 1818 he sent a letter to scientific institutions, universities, and members of Congress across the United States. The letter proposed that the Earth was hollow, composed of concentric spheres, and that it was open at the poles. He called these openings the Sims holes. Sims was not dismissed immediately. His idea generated genuine scientific debate. He lectured extensively. He gathered supporters, including a journalist named Jeremiah Reynolds, who took the idea further and lobbied the United States government to fund an expedition to find the polar opening. Reynolds was persuasive enough that Congress actually debated the proposal. An expedition was authorized by President John Quincy Adams, though it was canceled by his successor Andrew Jackson before it could be launched. That is worth pausing on. The United States government seriously considered funding an expedition to look for a hole in the Earth at the South Pole. Not because the government was credulous or ignorant, but because in the 1820s, the polar regions were almost entirely unexplored, and the idea of unknown geography at the poles was not unreasonable on its face. The hollow Earth theory evolved over the following century. It shed some of its more extreme features and picked up new ones. The version that became most culturally significant and most relevant to Antarctica specifically emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. A German writer named Karl Neupert and later a figure named Cyrus Teed in America each developed variations on the theme. But the version that matters most for our purposes is the one that circulated within certain German intellectual and quasi-mystical circles in the early 20th century. Specifically, it was adopted and promoted by groups connected to what historians call the Völkisch movement, the broad cultural and nationalist movement that eventually fed into National Socialism. Several organizations connected to this milieu, including the Thule Society and the Vril Society, incorporated hollow Earth ideas into their cosmologies. These were not mainstream scientific organizations. They were occult and nationalist groups that blended mythology, racial theory, and pseudoscience in ways that were bizarre and disturbing in equal measure. But they had real influence within German intellectual and eventually political circles. The Nazi connection to these ideas is documented. Heinrich Himmler, who headed the SS, was personally interested in occult and alternative scientific theories, including ideas about inner Earth geography. He funded research into these areas through an SS organization called the Ahnenerbe, which translates roughly as the Ancestral Heritage Foundation. The Ahnenerbe employed researchers who worked on projects that ranged from legitimate historical archaeology to things that were, by any reasonable standard, pseudoscientific. Whether any of this directly influenced the 1938 Antarctic expedition is something historians debate. What is documented is that the expedition took place, that it was thorough, and that it specifically noted the presence of geothermal activity and ice-free areas in the interior of the claimed territory. Geothermal features and ice-free zones in Antarctica are real. They exist. And they happen to be precisely the kind of features that would interest someone looking for evidence of unusual geographic conditions beneath the ice. There is a specific feature in Antarctica worth discussing here. In the Queen Maud Land region, which corresponds roughly to the area claimed by Germany as Neuschwabenland, there are documented geothermal features that create conditions unlike the surrounding Antarctic environment. Warm water springs, areas where the ice is significantly thinner than average, exposed rock in regions that are otherwise covered. These features are scientifically explained by volcanic activity beneath the ice. The geology of that part of Antarctica includes active and recently active volcanic systems. The scientific explanation is probably correct. But it is also the case that these features, seen from above by German reconnaissance aircraft in 1938, before the detailed geological understanding we have now, would have appeared genuinely anomalous. Areas of the Antarctic interior that did not match what you expected to find there. Now let us move to a different part of the story, because the hollow earth idea did not stay confined to German occultism. It also had a surprisingly persistent following within certain American military and scientific circles. Admiral Richard Byard, whom we discussed at length in the last chapter, is often cited in hollow earth literature. Some of these citations are fabricated or heavily distorted. There is a widely circulated account of Byard describing a flight into a polar opening and encountering a warm inner world with mammoths and green valleys. This account is almost certainly fictional. It appears to originate from hollow earth enthusiasts writing decades after Byard's death, and it has no basis in his documented writings or statements. What is real is that Byard did describe, in documented communications, flying over areas near the poles where conditions were unexpected. He noted warm air temperatures at altitude in locations where cold air should have predominated. He described seeing open water in areas that should have been frozen. These observations are in the historical record. The scientific explanation for these phenomena involves the dynamics of polar weather systems, the way warm air can be carried to high latitudes by atmospheric circulation, and the way Antarctic geography creates localized conditions that vary significantly from regional averages. These explanations are probably adequate. But Byard's observations contributed to a persistent idea that the poles were not fully understood, that there were anomalies there that existing models did not completely account for. There is also the matter of Operation Highjump itself. In hollow earth literature, Highjump is frequently described as a military operation sent to find and potentially neutralize beings or civilizations living within the Earth's interior. This is not documented anywhere in the historical record. It is the kind of elaboration that takes real anomalies and extends them far beyond what the evidence supports. What is documented and what is worth sitting with is that the geographic features of Antarctica genuinely do create conditions that can look, to an observer without full geological context, like evidence of something unusual. The geothermal systems, the subglacial lakes, the ice-free oases in the interior. The areas where the ice is moving in patterns that suggest unusual heat flow from below. These are all real features. They have scientific explanations, but they also have the quality of mystery that tends to attract theories. The hollow earth idea, in its most literal form, is wrong. But the instinct behind it, the sense that there is something beneath the Antarctic ice that we do not fully understand, is not entirely misplaced. There genuinely is something beneath the ice. Multiple things, in fact: ancient lakes, volcanic systems, geological formations that have not been exposed to direct observation since long before humans existed. Whether any of that qualifies as extraordinary depends on what you were expecting. If you expected ice all the way down, then finding ancient sealed lakes and active volcanic systems beneath kilometers of frozen surface is, in its own way, remarkable. Lake Vostok, which we will spend much more time on in a later chapter, sits beneath nearly 4 kilometers of ice. It has been sealed from the surface for somewhere between 15 and 25 million years. Whatever is in that water has been evolving in complete isolation from the rest of the biosphere for longer than our species has existed. That is not a hollow earth. But it is something that deserves the word extraordinary. The hollow earth theory persists in connection with Antarctica, not because it is true, but because Antarctica genuinely contains things that are unexpected. The gap between what people imagined was under all that ice, which is more ice, and what is actually there, which is an ancient, complex, partially volcanic landscape with sealed bodies of water that have been untouched for geological timescales, is wide enough to generate wonder. And wonder, in the absence of full information, tends to reach for the largest possible explanation. That reaching is human. It is not always accurate, but it is not always entirely wrong either. Sometimes the truth, when it finally comes out, is strange enough that the theories that preceded it, however inaccurate in their specifics, were at least pointing in the right direction. Something is beneath the Antarctic ice. We do not fully know what. The people who knew that something was there, even when they had no scientific framework to describe it, were not entirely mistaken in their instinct. They were just wrong about the details. There is a particular kind of silence that people bring back from Antarctica. Not the silence of someone who has nothing to say, the other kind. The silence of someone who has things to say and has decided, for reasons they do not always explain, not to say them. This is not universal. Many researchers who spend time at Antarctic stations come back and talk openly about their experience. They describe the isolation, the beauty, the psychological challenges, the profound strangeness of living in a place where the sun does not set for months and then does not rise for months. They write papers, give lectures, share photographs. The scientific literature on Antarctic psychology is substantial and openly available, but alongside that open literature, there is another layer, quieter, harder to access. It exists in the spaces between official reports, in informal conversations between researchers, in the accounts that surface years or decades after the fact when someone decides that enough time has passed. Let us start with what is formally documented, because the documented material is itself unusual enough to deserve attention. The psychological effects of Antarctic posting have been studied seriously since the early days of permanent research stations. The condition most commonly discussed is what researchers call the winterover syndrome. It affects personnel who spend the Antarctic winter, roughly April through October, at stations that become completely isolated when weather makes resupply and evacuation impossible. During this period, the same small group of people, typically between a dozen and a few dozen individuals depending on the station, live and work together in confined spaces with no possibility of leaving. The symptoms of winterover syndrome are well documented. They include sleep disturbances, cognitive slowing, irritability, social withdrawal, and a phenomenon called the third quarter effect, where morale and functioning drop significantly in the third quarter of the winter-over period before recovering slightly as the end approaches. These effects are real, measurable, and consistent across different stations and different national programs. They are also, to a degree, expected and managed. Antarctic programs have developed screening processes to select personnel who are psychologically suited to the conditions. They have protocols for managing interpersonal conflict in confined groups. They have communication systems that give winter-over personnel some connection to the outside world. The programs take the psychological dimension seriously. What is less formally discussed is the other category, the experiences that do not fit neatly into winter-over syndrome or any other recognized clinical framework. The things that researchers have reported, informally, that fall outside what isolation and darkness and confinement can fully explain. A researcher who spent multiple seasons at a major Antarctic station and who asked not to be identified by name in the account where this was documented, described a period during their second winter-over when several members of the station crew reported the same auditory experience on the same night. They heard what they described as a low, rhythmic sound coming from below the station floor, not from the machinery, which they knew the sound of intimately after months of listening to nothing else. From below the machinery, from below the floor, from somewhere deeper, the station was investigated. Nothing was found. The official conclusion was that the sound was likely a combination of ice movement, which is a real and documented phenomenon, and the psychological amplification that occurs when isolated people in a high-stress environment encounter ambiguous sensory input. That explanation is reasonable. Ice does move. It does make sounds, and isolated people under stress do interpret ambiguous sensory input in ways that are shaped by their fears and expectations. What makes this particular account harder to dismiss entirely is that the sound was reported independently by multiple people before any of them had discussed it with each other. The station commander only became aware that others had heard it when crew members separately reported it over the course of a day. The consistency of the description across independent reporters is the detail that does not fit as cleanly into the standard explanation. This kind of account is not unique. There are others. They appear in different forms, from different stations, across different decades. A Danish researcher at a small inland station in the 1980s, an American support staff member at McMurdo in the mid-1990s. A group of Russian scientists at Vostok in the early 2000s, whose account surfaced in a Russian science journal that was later quietly removed from online archives. The Vostok account is particularly interesting, and we will come back to it in more detail in the chapter on subglacial lakes. But the relevant element here is that several of the Vostok winter-over personnel from that period reportedly requested reassignment after their posting ended and declined to discuss their reasons with program administrators in the standard debriefing format. Requests for reassignment after a posting are not unusual. The specific refusal to engage with debriefing questions is more unusual because debriefing participation is typically a condition of future program involvement. These personnel, as far as can be determined from the available record, did not return to Antarctic postings. And they did not, in any documented public forum, describe what prompted their requests for reassignment. There is also a pattern that several researchers who study Antarctic personnel psychology have noted informally, though it has not, to my knowledge, been the subject of a formal published study. Personnel who are posted to certain interior stations, as opposed to coastal stations, show a statistically higher rate of what the programs classify as adjustment difficulties after returning, not during their posting, which is when you would expect the difficulties to peak, but after. When they are back in normal environments, around normal people, under normal conditions, the explanation usually offered is that readjustment to populated environments after extended isolation is genuinely difficult. This is true. It has parallels in other extreme isolation experiences, including long-duration spaceflight and submarine deployments. The brain adapts to the conditions of extreme isolation in ways that take time to reverse. But the pattern among interior station personnel is more pronounced than among coastal station personnel, even when controlling for posting duration and isolation level. Interior stations are not necessarily more isolated than coastal stations in terms of human contact. Some coastal stations are smaller and more remote. The difference seems to be something about the interior environment specifically, not just the isolation. What is different about the interior? The obvious answer is the geography. Interior Antarctic stations sit above the deep subglacial landscape, above ancient lakes, above geothermal systems, above geological formations that have not been touched by surface conditions for millions of years. The ice above these features behaves differently than ice over solid rock. It moves differently, sounds different, creates different conditions in the spaces where people live above it. Whether that geographical difference is enough to explain the psychological difference in returning personnel is not something anyone has publicly investigated in a rigorous way. It has been noted. It has not been studied. There are also the accounts that involve explicit instructions about disclosure. Several former Antarctic personnel, across different national programs, have described being told, in terms that ranged from informal to quite direct, that certain aspects of their experience at particular stations were not to be discussed publicly. The framing of these instructions varied. Some were described as standard security briefings relating to the technical specifications of research equipment. Some were more specifically focused on particular incidents or observations during the posting. The existence of confidentiality requirements in Antarctic research programs is not itself remarkable. Some research conducted at these stations involves technology or methodologies with military or intelligence applications. Classification of that material is expected and appropriate. national programs have legitimate reasons to keep some of their Antarctic research non-public. What is more unusual is when the confidentiality instructions extend to experiential rather than technical material. When personnel are asked not to discuss not what they were doing, which can be classified for obvious reasons, but what they saw or heard or felt in a particular place. That kind of instruction suggests that the thing being protected is not a technical secret. It is an experiential one. A former American contractor who worked support roles at McMurdo Station and at one interior facility over multiple seasons described, in an interview conducted years after his last Antarctic posting, being given what he called an informal talk before leaving the interior facility for the final time. The talk was conducted by a program administrator he had not previously met. It covered several topics, including routine matters about contractor confidentiality and non-disclosure of proprietary research. But it also included what he described as a suggestion, framed politely but clearly, that he not discuss certain anomalous experiences he had reported during his time at that facility. He did not specify in the interview what those experiences were. He said only that they were the kind of thing that was easy to explain away with standard psychological or environmental factors, and that the administrator had, in fact, offered those explanations during the talk, but that the tone of the conversation, the care with which it was conducted, the seniority of the person conducting it, had left him with the impression that the explanations being offered were less about informing him and more about guiding him toward a particular way of describing his experience, if he chose to describe it at all. He chose for many years not to describe it at all, which is itself a kind of description. These accounts do not constitute proof of anything hidden or extraordinary at Antarctic research stations. The psychological effects of extreme environment are real and well documented. People under stress in isolated conditions experience things that are shaped by that stress and isolation. Auditory experiences, heightened pattern recognition, an amplified sense of significance around ambiguous events. These are all documented features of extreme environment psychology. But the consistency of certain elements across unconnected accounts from different nations, different decades, different types of personnel, the underground sounds, the post-return adjustment difficulties concentrated at interior stations, the informal guidance about what not to discuss, these consistencies are harder to attribute entirely to the general effects of isolation. Something about certain parts of Antarctica does things to people, not to all people, not in dramatic or obviously explicable ways, but in quiet, persistent, hard-to-dismiss ways that accumulate when you look at enough accounts from enough different sources. The scientists who came back different did not, mostly, come back claiming they had seen extraordinary things. They came back quieter, more careful about what they said, more aware of the gap between what they experienced and what they felt they could describe in terms that would be taken seriously. That kind of careful silence is its own form of testimony. It does not tell you what happened, but it tells you that something did, and that something, whatever it is, left a mark that the standard explanations do not quite cover. There is a lake in Antarctica that has not seen sunlight in somewhere between 15 and 25 million years. It sits beneath nearly 4 kilometers of ice, in complete darkness, under pressure that would be crushing to anything we think of as normal life. It has been sealed from the surface since before our species existed, since before most of the mammals we recognize today had evolved into their current forms. It predates the ice sheet that covers it. Its name is Lake Vostok, and it is real. This is not a theory. It is not a rumor. It is a documented geographic and geological feature, confirmed by decades of seismic surveys, ice-penetrating radar, and eventually direct measurement. Lake Vostok is approximately 250 kilometers long and 50 kilometers wide. It is roughly the size of Lake Ontario. It contains an estimated 5,400 cubic kilometers of liquid water. It is one of the largest lakes on Earth by volume, and it exists in a place where, by any surface-level logic, a lake has no business existing. The reason it is liquid, rather than frozen solid like everything around it, is a combination of factors. Geothermal heat from below warms the water from underneath. The enormous weight of the ice sheet above creates pressure that lowers the freezing point of water. The result is a stable, ancient body of liquid water in one of the coldest places on Earth, insulated from the surface by kilometers of ice that have been accumulating since before human civilization began. When researchers first confirmed Vostok's existence through indirect measurement in the 1990s, the scientific response was significant. Here was a lake that had been isolated from the rest of the biosphere for geological timescales. Whatever was living in that water, if anything was living in that water, had been evolving in complete isolation. No sunlight, no contact with surface organisms, no exchange of genetic material with anything outside that sealed environment. The implications for biology were extraordinary. If life could exist in Lake Vostok, under those conditions, in that kind of isolation, it would represent a form of life adapted to circumstances unlike anything previously studied. It would also, researchers noted, have parallels to the subsurface oceans believed to exist on Jupiter's moon Europa and Saturn's moon Enceladus. Vostok was, in a sense, a test case. If life was there, it would be the strongest evidence, yet that life could exist in similarly extreme environments elsewhere in the solar system. The question of whether to drill into Vostok became one of the most significant and contentious debates in Antarctic science. On one side were researchers who wanted to access the lake directly. The scientific value of samples from a sealed, ancient lake was obvious. What organisms might be living there? What chemistry the water contained? What biological and geological history was preserved in that sealed environment? On the other side were researchers who argued that drilling into Vostok risked contaminating the lake with surface organisms carried down through the drill hole. Once contaminated, the lake's ancient biological record would be compromised. The thing that made it scientifically valuable would be partially destroyed by the act of studying it. This debate ran for decades. International scientific bodies weighed in. Environmental protocols were debated. The difficulty of designing a drill system that could penetrate nearly 4 kilometers of ice without introducing contamination was immense. The Russians, whose Vostok station sits directly above the lake and gave it its name, were the primary proponents of drilling. They had been drilling through the ice at that location for other purposes, including ice core research, since the 1970s. By the 1990s, their drill was within a few hundred meters of the lake's surface. The international scientific community repeatedly asked them to pause, to wait until contamination prevention technology was adequate. The Russians continued drilling. In February 2012, the Russian drill broke through the ice into the lake itself. The news was announced with considerable fanfare. Samples were retrieved. The world waited to hear what had been found. What was announced publicly was modest. Bacterial contamination in the initial samples made it impossible to determine whether organisms found in the retrieved water were from the lake itself or from the drilling process. The Russians maintained that some of the genetic material they found did not match any known organism and was therefore likely a genuine Vostok species. Other researchers disputed this, arguing the contamination made any biological conclusions unreliable. Further drilling and sampling happened in subsequent seasons. Results were published. Papers were written, and then gradually the public conversation about Vostok went quiet, not because the research stopped. The research continued. Russian teams returned each season. Ice cores were analyzed. Water samples were processed. The scientific work went on, but the public announcements became less frequent. The results that were published became more technical and more narrowly scoped. The broad questions: what is alive in that lake? What does it tell us about the limits of life? What does it mean? Stopped being addressed in public-facing scientific communication the way they had been in the years leading up to the 2012 breakthrough. This quieting is not, by itself, proof of anything. Science often works that way. The dramatic discovery phase gives way to years of careful, unglamorous data processing. Results take time. Conclusions take longer. The public's attention moves on before the science is finished, and by the time results are ready, nobody is paying attention anymore. That is one explanation. It is plausible. But there are researchers in the broader Antarctic science community who have noted, in the careful language of people who choose their words deliberately, that the Vostok findings have been handled with unusual institutional caution. That data sharing, which is a cornerstone of international Antarctic science under the treaty framework, has been less complete in the case of Vostok research than in comparable projects. That requests for raw data from international collaborators have been met with delays and partial compliance rather than the open exchange that the treaty framework is supposed to guarantee. Whether this reflects Russian institutional protectiveness over research they have invested decades in, legitimate concerns about data interpretation before publication, or something else, is not something that can be determined from the outside. What can be noted is that the combination of factors around Vostok, the extraordinary scientific significance of the lake, the contentious drilling history, the initial findings that suggested but did not confirm novel organisms, and the subsequent quieting of public scientific communication creates a gap between what was promised and what was delivered. Vostok is not the only subglacial lake in Antarctica. It is the largest and most famous, but it is far from alone. The latest comprehensive surveys suggest there are over 400 subglacial lakes beneath the Antarctic ice sheet. Many of them are interconnected through subglacial drainage systems, water flowing beneath the ice from one lake to another through channels carved by pressure and geothermal heat. This means the subglacial environment of Antarctica is not a collection of isolated pockets. It is, in some sense, a connected system. Water moves through it, and if life exists in it, that life has pathways to spread, to connect, to potentially reach conditions different from those at any single lake. Lake Ellsworth in West Antarctica was the target of a British drilling project that was abandoned in 2012 after equipment failures prevented the drill from reaching the lake. The project was funded significantly and technically sophisticated. Its failure was attributed to engineering problems with the hot water drill system used to melt through the ice. A second attempt has been planned but has faced continued delays. Lake Whillans, a smaller subglacial lake, was successfully accessed by an American team in 2013. Unlike Vostok, where contamination concerns were never fully resolved, the Whillans drilling was conducted with technology designed to prevent contamination. What they found was genuine. Microbial life, bacterial cells adapted to dark, cold, high-pressure conditions, living in water that had been sealed beneath the ice for a very long time. Life exists under the Antarctic ice. That is now confirmed, not theorized, not suggested, confirmed. The organisms found at Whillans were, in scientific terms, not dramatically alien. They were bacteria, comprehensible within existing biological frameworks, using chemical energy rather than sunlight to survive. Remarkable in context, not incomprehensible in nature. But Whillans is a relatively shallow, relatively recently sealed lake. Vostok is older, deeper, more isolated, and almost certainly more biologically unusual. What the organisms in Vostok have become after millions of years of sealed evolution is something that the published record does not yet fully address. There is also the matter of what the ice cores themselves contain. The ice sheet covering Antarctica is a frozen archive of Earth's atmospheric history. Ice cores drilled at Vostok and other locations contain trapped air bubbles from hundreds of thousands of years ago. The chemistry of those bubbles has told scientists an enormous amount about past climate, atmospheric composition, and volcanic activity across geological timescales. Some of what the ice cores have revealed has implications that go beyond climate science. Spikes in certain chemical signatures at specific points in the ice record correspond to events that are not fully explained by known volcanic or atmospheric processes. These anomalies have been the subject of specialized research. They have not, to my knowledge, generated public controversy. But they exist in the data, and they represent questions that the ice has posed that have not yet been fully answered. The ice is also, in a geological sense, not static. The Antarctic ice sheet moves. It flows toward the coasts under its own weight. This movement is well studied and well modeled, but the subglacial landscape over which it moves is not uniform, and the interactions between the moving ice and the terrain beneath it create dynamics that are still being mapped. There are regions where the ice is moving faster than models predict, where heat flow from below is higher than the surface geology would suggest, where the ice thickness varies in ways that indicate unusual conditions at the base. These regions are distributed across the continent in patterns that researchers are still working to understand. Antarctica is hiding things beneath its ice. That sentence is almost literally true in the most straightforward geological sense. It is hiding ancient lakes, ancient organisms, ancient atmospheric records, geological formations that have not seen light for millions of years, and dynamic systems that we are only beginning to understand. Whether it is also hiding things in the human sense, things that were put there rather than simply left there by geological time, is a different question, one that the scientific record does not directly answer. But what the scientific record does tell us is that the gap between what we thought was under the Antarctic ice and what is actually there is enormous. And if the gap between expectation and reality is that large in the areas we have managed to study, the question of what exists in the areas we have not studied becomes significantly more interesting. There are 400 subglacial lakes. We have directly accessed 2 of them. The other 398 are still sealed, still dark, still waiting. Whatever is in them has had millions of years to become whatever it has become. We will probably not know what that is for a very long time. And in the meantime, the ice will keep its secrets in the way that only geological time can, patiently, completely, without any sense that the waiting matters one way or another. There is something specific that happens when a person first starts looking at satellite imagery of Antarctica with genuine attention. Not the kind of looking where you glance at a white continent on a world map and move on. The kind where you zoom in, move slowly across the terrain, and spend real time with what the images are actually showing. What happens usually is that the continent stops feeling simple. Antarctica from above looks at first pass like what you expect, white, vast. Featureless in the way that extreme environments tend to look featureless until you learn their language, but spend enough time with the imagery and the features start to emerge. the texture of the ice changes, ridges and depressions become visible. The coastline, where ice meets ocean, is more complex than any map suggests, and in certain locations, scattered across the continent in ways that do not follow any obvious geographic logic, there are things that do not look like ice. Some of those things have explanations. Rocky outcrops, nunataks they are called, where mountain peaks push through the ice surface. Research station infrastructure, visible as dark geometric shapes against the white. Supply routes, marked by the compressed tracks of heavy vehicles. These are all real and documented features of the Antarctic surface. But some of the things that catch attention in the imagery are harder to place. The practice of examining Antarctic satellite imagery for anomalies has been ongoing in informal research communities since Google Earth made high-resolution imagery widely accessible in the mid-2000s. Before that, detailed satellite coverage of Antarctica was largely restricted to government and institutional access. When it became available to anyone with an internet connection, a significant number of people started looking. What they found, and what has been documented in enough detail to take seriously, falls into a few categories. The first category is geometric shapes. Antarctica is a place where natural processes do not typically produce clean geometric forms at large scale. Ice formations, rock outcrops, and glacial features have their own geometries, but these tend toward the organic. Curves, irregular edges, the kind of shapes that process rather than intention produces. When researchers find shapes in Antarctic imagery that are unusually regular, unusually symmetrical, or unusually large while maintaining geometric consistency, these become points of interest. Several such shapes have been documented in Antarctic imagery over the years. The most discussed is a feature in the Ellsworth Mountains that, in certain image resolutions and lighting conditions, appears to show a large rectangular or trapezoidal structure partially buried by snow and ice. The dimensions of the apparent structure, estimated from the scale of the surrounding terrain, would make it significantly larger than any known research facility in Antarctica. The feature has been examined by multiple independent observers using imagery from different satellite platforms and different time periods. The consensus among those observers is that something is there. The disagreement is about what it is. Some argue it is a natural rock formation, a nunatak of unusual regularity shaped by glacial pressure over geological time. Others argue the regularity exceeds what natural processes typically produce. The official record does not, to my knowledge, contain a specific public explanation of that particular feature. The second category is imagery alterations. This is the one that tends to generate the most skepticism, because claims about altered imagery are easy to make and difficult to verify. But the documented cases are worth examining carefully. Google Earth imagery is assembled from multiple sources, acquired at different times, processed through multiple systems, and stitched together into a continuous surface. The seams and inconsistencies in this process are real and generate artifacts that can look, to an untrained eye, like deliberate alterations when they are actually technical byproducts. This caveat is important and genuine. With that caveat in mind, there are specific locations in Antarctic imagery where the alteration does not match the expected pattern of technical artifacts. Pixels that are blurred in shapes that do not follow the geometry of imaging errors. Regions where the resolution drops abruptly at boundaries that do not correspond to the edges of image tiles. Areas where the imagery from one time period shows features that are absent or obscured in later imagery without obvious environmental explanation. One specific location that has been examined extensively by independent researchers sits at approximately 72 degrees south latitude in a region without publicly listed research facilities. The imagery at this location, across multiple Google Earth updates over several years, shows a pattern of recurring blurring that is centered on a specific set of coordinates rather than following the variable pattern of technical artifacts. Each update to the imagery has maintained the blurring in approximately the same location. When observers have attempted to cross-reference this location against other satellite imagery platforms, including imagery from ESA satellites and from commercially available high-resolution sources, the results have been inconsistent in ways that are themselves interesting. Some platforms show clearer imagery of the location. Some show similar blurring. The variation across platforms does not follow any obvious technical logic. The standard explanation for government-requested imagery blurring is national security. Governments regularly request that commercial satellite operators blur or withhold imagery of sensitive locations. Military bases, nuclear facilities, certain government buildings in various countries have been documented as subjects of these requests. The practice is acknowledged and is not itself controversial. What is not publicly documented is whether any such requests have been made for Antarctic locations, by whom, or for what stated reason. Antarctic research stations are not military facilities, at least officially. The treaty framework explicitly prohibits military installations. If imagery of Antarctic locations is being altered at government request, the justification would need to fit within a framework that does not involve military secrets, because Antarctica is not supposed to have military secrets. Unless something is happening there that does not fit neatly into the categories the treaty framework anticipated. The third category is the anomalies that were visible and then disappeared. This is harder to document precisely because it requires comparing imagery across time periods, which depends on having archived versions of older imagery before it was updated. Several researchers who made a practice of archiving Antarctic imagery have documented cases where features visible in early Google Earth imagery were absent or obscured in later updates. One case involves a location near the coast of East Antarctica where early imagery appeared to show a regular grid pattern beneath the ice surface, visible as subtle variations in ice texture and reflectivity. The pattern was consistent across several early image sets. In later updates, the area shows uniform ice texture without the underlying pattern. Ice movement can change surface texture over time, but the specific disappearance of a geometric pattern while surrounding areas show unchanged texture is unusual. Another case involves what appeared to be an entrance or opening in a coastal ice formation. The feature was photographed and documented by several observers using early Google Earth imagery. Later imagery of the same location shows the area as uniform ice cliff with no visible opening. The change could reflect actual physical change in the ice formation, which does change over time. It could also reflect a change in what the imagery is showing. There is also the matter of flight path data. Commercial aircraft tracking services, which became publicly available in the early 2010s, allow anyone to monitor the routes taken by commercial flights. Researchers examining flight path data for Southern Hemisphere routes have noted, consistent with what we discussed in the previous chapter on no-fly zones, that certain Antarctic coordinates simply do not appear in flight path data. Not as avoided zones, which would show up as deliberate routing around them, but as absent, as if the relevant tracking infrastructure does not cover those specific areas. This could be a coverage gap in the tracking network rather than an intentional exclusion. The technology works by receiving signals from aircraft transponders, and coverage in remote polar regions is less complete than in populated areas. Gaps in Antarctic flight tracking data are expected and not inherently suspicious. What is more interesting is when the gaps are precise and specific rather than diffuse and general. A broad coverage gap over a large region makes technical sense. A coverage gap that is centered on specific coordinates while surrounding areas show normal coverage is harder to explain through pure technical limitation. There is one more category that deserves mention. Several researchers who have examined Antarctic imagery have noted what they describe as objects in the water around the continent, not on the ice, in the ocean. Shapes that appear in satellite imagery of Antarctic coastal waters that do not match the profile of known vessel types and do not appear in vessel tracking databases for the times when the imagery was acquired. Unidentified objects in Antarctic waters could be many things. Ice floes of unusual shape. Whales which are large enough to appear in high-resolution satellite imagery. Equipment left by research expeditions. The ocean around Antarctica is not well monitored, and unexplained objects in its waters are not automatically significant. But several of the documented cases involve objects that are too geometrically regular to be ice or marine life, too large to be equipment debris, and positioned in areas where no vessels were logged as operating at the relevant time. These cases are a small subset of the broader pattern. But they are consistent with it. What ties these categories together is not any single piece of dramatic evidence. It is the pattern. Multiple independent observers, using different tools, examining different aspects of Antarctic imagery and data, keep arriving at the same general conclusion: that there are specific locations in Antarctica where the available information is incomplete in ways that do not fully match the expected patterns of technical limitation or natural variation, and that these locations tend to cluster in certain parts of the continent rather than being randomly distributed. Clusters are interesting. Random technical artifacts and natural imagery anomalies would be expected to distribute randomly across a large area. Anomalies that cluster suggest a common source, something about specific locations that makes them generate more apparent anomalies than surrounding areas. What is in those locations is not something the satellite imagery can tell us directly. By its nature, altered or incomplete imagery is precisely the kind of evidence that prevents definitive conclusions. You cannot see what has been hidden by looking at the hiding. What you can see is the shape of the hiding, where it happens, how consistently it happens, whether it follows a pattern that makes sense under innocent explanations, or whether it requires something more to account for. The imagery of Antarctica, looked at carefully and over time, raises questions that the standard explanations answer partially, but not completely. The answers that are missing tend to cluster in the same places that the imagery anomalies cluster. That correspondence is not proof. But it is the kind of thing that, once you have noticed it, is difficult to unnotice. And Antarctica, as a place, seems to have a great deal of things like that, individually dismissible, collectively persistent. It's the kind of pattern that does not announce itself, but accumulates quietly in the background, until one day you realize you have been looking at it for a long time without quite seeing it whole. There is a difference between ownership and control. This distinction matters in most areas of human organization, but it matters especially in Antarctica, because the Antarctic Treaty was built around the idea that nobody owns the continent. That idea is real and legally meaningful, but it has almost nothing to do with who actually controls what happens there. Control is not a legal concept. It is a practical one. It is about who has the resources, the infrastructure, the presence, and the influence to determine what occurs in a given place. And when you look at Antarctica through that lens rather than through the lens of the treaty framework, the picture that emerges is quite different from the one that official documents describe. Start with the basics of presence. There are approximately 70 research stations in Antarctica, operated by roughly 30 different nations. Some of these stations are permanent, staffed year-round. Some are seasonal, operating only during the Antarctic summer. Some are little more than small shelters used occasionally by field researchers. The distribution of these stations across the continent is not random. It reflects the priorities and capabilities of the nations that built them. The United States operates the largest and most capable Antarctic infrastructure. McMurdo Station, on Ross Island, is effectively a small town. It has a population of over 1,000 people during summer operations. It has an airfield capable of handling large aircraft. It has laboratories, accommodation, medical facilities, a power plant, and the logistical infrastructure to support deep field operations across a large portion of the continent. It is the hub around which a significant amount of Antarctic activity, not just American activity, is organized. Amundsen-Scott South Pole Station, operated by the United States at the geographic South Pole itself, is perhaps the most symbolically significant facility on the continent. It sits at the precise point around which the entire continent rotates, the bottom of the world in the most literal sense. The United States has maintained a permanent presence at the South Pole since 1956. No other nation has a facility at the South Pole. The United States is the only country that has chosen to place permanent infrastructure at the most symbolically and strategically central point on the continent, and it has maintained that presence without interruption for nearly 70 years. Russia's Antarctic program is the second oldest and in many ways the most strategically positioned. Vostok Station, which we have discussed at length, sits above the largest subglacial lake on Earth. Mirny Station on the coast serves as a logistics hub. Russia has maintained a continuous Antarctic presence since 1956, the same year as the United States, and has consistently positioned its facilities in locations that maximize coverage of the continent's interior. The Soviet, and later Russian, approach to Antarctic positioning has always been strategically coherent. The stations are not clustered near convenient coastal locations. They are distributed across the continent in ways that, taken together, provide coverage of the major geographic and geological features. Vostok is not logistically convenient. It is extraordinarily difficult and expensive to maintain. Russia maintains it anyway, and has for decades, because whatever is beneath it is worth the cost. China is the most significant recent development in Antarctic power dynamics. China's Antarctic program began in 1984 with its first expedition and the establishment of Great Wall Station on King George Island. In the decades since, China has dramatically expanded its Antarctic presence. It now operates 5 stations, with a 6th under construction. It has launched its own Antarctic resupply and research vessels. It has developed independent air transport capability for Antarctic operations. The pace of China's Antarctic buildup has been notable. Between 2010 and 2025, China has invested more in Antarctic infrastructure than any other nation in that period. The new stations have been built in locations that fill gaps in China's continental coverage, and at least one of them sits in a region that is strategically significant relative to both subglacial geology and potential future resource extraction. Chinese researchers have contributed substantially to Antarctic science. Their published research is real and significant, but the scale of investment, the pace of development, and the specific locations chosen for new facilities all suggest that scientific research is not the only consideration driving Chinese Antarctic strategy. Other nations with significant Antarctic presences include Australia, which claims the largest territorial sector of the continent under the Frozen Claims System, the United Kingdom, Argentina, Chile, Germany, France, Japan, South Korea, and India. Each of these programs reflects its nation's particular strategic and scientific interests. Together, they represent a significant investment of national resources in a place that is officially a zone of peaceful scientific cooperation. The cost of maintaining Antarctic infrastructure is enormous. The logistics of supplying stations that can only be reached by icebreaker ship or by aircraft operating at the limits of their range, in weather conditions that can ground all operations for weeks at a time in temperatures that destroy ordinary equipment, require sustained investment that is difficult to justify purely on the basis of the scientific output those stations generate. The published scientific research from Antarctic programs is substantial and genuinely valuable. Climate data, atmospheric research, astronomical observations made possible by the continent's extreme dryness and altitude. Biological discoveries of real significance. These outputs are real, but they do not fully explain the scale of investment across multiple nations over multiple decades. When you spend this much money on infrastructure in a place, you are protecting interests that go beyond what the infrastructure officially supports. That is a basic principle of how states operate. Public justifications for expenditure rarely capture the full range of interests being served. The resource question is the one that hovers over all of this without ever quite being addressed directly in public discourse. Antarctica is believed to contain significant reserves of coal, iron ore, and other minerals. The continental shelf around Antarctica is thought to be a potentially significant source of oil and natural gas. The fresh water locked in the ice sheet is, as climate change increasingly stresses global water supplies, a resource of almost incalculable potential value. The Madrid Protocol bans resource extraction until 2048 at the earliest. But 2048 is not far away in terms of strategic planning. Nations that are seriously thinking about long-term resource access do not wait until the year the ban expires to begin positioning themselves. They position themselves decades in advance. They establish presence. They conduct research that generates data useful for extraction planning. They build infrastructure that can be repurposed. The research stations that exist in Antarctica today would, in many cases, serve as excellent foundational infrastructure for resource extraction operations. The airfields, the logistics networks, the accommodation facilities, the power systems, all of these have uses that extend beyond scientific research. This is not an accusation. It is an observation about how infrastructure works and how states plan. Building Antarctic infrastructure now, while the treaty framework is in place, creates presence and capability that will matter when and if that framework changes. The treaty itself is not permanent. The original 1959 agreement was designed to last 30 years, after which it could be reviewed. It has been reviewed and strengthened, but strengthened is not the same as permanent. The Madrid Protocol's extraction ban has a specific review date. The consultative parties to the treaty, the nations with full voting rights in the treaty system, are exactly the nations with the largest Antarctic presences. Their interests are aligned around maintaining access, not around limiting it. When the moment comes to revisit resource extraction, the nations that have spent decades building infrastructure in the most geologically interesting parts of Antarctica will not be in the same position as nations that maintained only modest presences. Presence translates to leverage. Leverage translates to influence over outcomes. There is also the question of private interests. The Antarctic Treaty governs state activity. It was designed in an era when the only entities capable of operating in Antarctica were national governments. That is no longer true. Private companies have been operating in Antarctica in various capacities for decades. The tourism industry, which brings tens of thousands of visitors to Antarctic waters annually, is privately operated within a regulatory framework. But more significant is the quiet expansion of private research and resource survey activities that have occurred within the framework of national programs. National Antarctic programs routinely involve private contractors for logistics, construction, and operational support. Some of those contractors are large companies with their own strategic interests in Antarctic data and access. The information generated by research programs, the geological surveys, the subglacial mapping, the resource assessments, flows not just to national governments, but to the private entities involved in conducting the work. The line between public scientific research and private resource intelligence is not always clear in the Antarctic context. It is probably not always intended to be clear. There have also been direct attempts by private interests to assert a presence in Antarctica outside the national program framework. Several companies have at various times proposed private Antarctic research stations, private tourism infrastructure, and private resource survey operations. Most of these proposals have been blocked or redirected through the treaty framework, but the attempts reflect a recognition in the private sector that Antarctica represents a significant future opportunity. The question of who actually controls Antarctica, then, does not have a simple answer. The treaty framework says nobody controls it. The practical reality is that control is distributed among the nations with the largest presences, with the United States and Russia holding the longest established and most strategically positioned infrastructure, and with China rapidly closing the gap. Within those national programs, private interests exert influence that is real but not fully visible in public accounts. The data generated by Antarctic research has value that extends beyond academic publication, and the entities involved in generating that data are not always purely public institutions with purely public interests. The continent that was supposed to belong to everyone has, in practice, become a place where power is exercised by those with the resources to exercise it. As it always does, as it always has, the treaty is real, the cooperation is real. And underneath both of those things, running quietly and persistently, is the same logic of strategic competition and resource positioning that governs how powerful entities behave everywhere else on Earth. Antarctica did not escape that logic. It just delayed it and dressed it in the language of science and built it a series of very expensive research stations at the bottom of the world and told the rest of us that what was happening there was too cold and too remote to be worth worrying about. Whether that is true depends entirely on what you think is worth worrying about. We have covered a lot of ground, more than most people think about when they think about Antarctica, which for most people is not very often. A frozen continent at the bottom of the world, remote. Cold, scientific, peaceful, officially. The kind of place that exists in the background of human awareness without ever quite demanding attention. And yet here we are at the end of a long story, and the thing that stays with me most is not any single piece of what we have discussed, not the treaty signed too quickly, not the military operation that came home early, not the submarines that surfaced months after the war ended with nothing in their holds and no explanation for where they had been, not the lake sealed under 4 kilometers of ice for 20 million years. Not the satellite imagery that shows something in the places where nothing official is supposed to be. The thing that stays with me is the silence. Not the physical silence of the continent itself, though that is real and profound in ways that people who have been there describe as unlike any other silence on Earth. I mean the other kind. The institutional silence. The deliberate, organized, sustained absence of complete explanation that surrounds Antarctica in the public record. This kind of silence is not accidental. Accidental silence looks different. It is scattered, inconsistent, full of the kind of gaps that come from bureaucratic disorganization or simple neglect. The silence around Antarctica is none of those things. It is consistent. It holds across decades, across changes of government, across different nations with competing interests in nearly every other domain. It is the silence of a shared decision, maintained without a single public meeting to maintain it. That is unusual. It is worth sitting with. We have talked about individual pieces of this story as if they were separate threads. The Nazi expeditions, the post-war military operations, the treaty, the restricted zones, the subglacial lakes, the satellite anomalies, the scientists who came back changed. Each of these threads, taken alone, can be explained away. History is full of coincidences that look significant in retrospect, but are not. Governments classify things for reasons that are mundane more often than they are extraordinary. Scientists sometimes do not talk about their work because science takes time, not because the work is secret. Individual threads can be explained. But when you look at all of them together, at the pattern they form when you step back far enough to see the whole shape, the explanations start to require more effort, more coincidence, more mundanity applied to a greater number of unusual things. At some point, when you need a very large number of mundane explanations to account for a very large number of unusual convergences, the mundane explanations start to cost more than they save. I am not saying something extraordinary is hidden in Antarctica. I want to be careful about that. Because the honest position, the one that the evidence actually supports, is not certainty in either direction. It is not that something is definitely there and being concealed, and it is not that everything is exactly as officially described and there is nothing more to understand. The honest position is that we do not know, and the reason we do not know is not because the questions have been answered. It is because the questions have not been asked loudly enough, consistently enough, or by enough people with access to the places and documents where the answers might live. That is a different kind of not knowing. It is the kind that comes from a door being closed rather than from the room behind it being empty. Antarctica became a protected, treaty-governed, internationally managed space in 1959. In the 65 years since then, it has been continuously occupied by the world's most powerful nations. It has been the site of scientific research that has, genuinely, produced knowledge of enormous value. It has also been the site of activities that are not fully described in any public document available to ordinary people. The gap between those two things, between what is known and what is not, is the space where the silence lives. What might fill that silence? This is the question I keep returning to, and the honest answer is that I can offer possibilities rather than conclusions. One possibility is that the silence is primarily about resources, that the major powers have known for decades that Antarctica contains extractable wealth on a scale that would reshape global economics, and that the silence is about managing the timeline and the access to that wealth. The treaty framework under this reading is less about protecting Antarctica and more about preventing any single nation from claiming the prize before the others are ready to compete for it. The silence is strategic delay, not concealment of the extraordinary. This possibility is consistent with most of what we know. It does not require anything beyond the normal logic of how powerful states behave when they have identified something valuable. Another possibility is that what has been found in Antarctica is scientifically extraordinary in ways that have not been publicly disclosed, because the implications are too significant to manage, not necessarily artificial, not necessarily the product of human or non-human intelligence, but biological or geological findings that would require a rethinking of assumptions that underpin large parts of how we understand the world. Life in Lake Vostok that does not fit existing biological categories. Geological formations that suggest geological processes not currently in scientific models. Evidence preserved in the ice of events in Earth's history that would complicate narratives that various interests have reasons to maintain. This possibility is harder to evaluate but not unreasonable. Science has a long history of findings being managed or delayed because their implications were inconvenient. Not always through deliberate suppression, sometimes through the natural conservatism of institutions that prefer established models to disruptive ones. A third possibility, the one that requires the most from us to consider seriously, is that something is in Antarctica that is not the product of known natural processes or human activity. Something that predates human presence on the continent, or that arrived there from somewhere else, or that exists in the subglacial environment in a form we do not have adequate concepts to describe. I offer this possibility not because I believe it to be likely, but because the pattern of official silence around Antarctica, across the specific categories where silence is most notable, is consistent with the kind of silence that surrounds things that are genuinely difficult to explain within existing frameworks. When something is simply secret, the silence around it has a shape. It is managed. It follows the contours of what is being protected. When something is genuinely not understood, the silence has a different quality. It is more diffuse, more uncertain. It contains, if you listen carefully, the sound of people choosing not to speculate out loud about things they have seen or measured but cannot account for. The silence around Antarctica contains elements of both. There are aspects of it that feel managed. The treaty framework, the restricted zones, the carefully bounded access for civilians and journalists, the way that governments with competing interests in everything else maintain remarkable consistency in what they do and do not say about Antarctica. This managed quality suggests coordination. Something being protected by an arrangement that has been deliberately maintained, and there are aspects of the silence that feel like something else. The researchers who came back quieter, the scientific results that were promised and never fully delivered. The specific locations where the imagery is incomplete and the data is thin and the questions pile up without resolution. These feel less like management and more like uncertainty. Like the silence of people who encountered something they did not have adequate language for and chose, rationally, to say nothing rather than say something that would not be believed. These two qualities of silence, the managed and the uncertain, are not mutually exclusive. They can coexist. In fact, they often do, in situations where something extraordinary is being handled by ordinary institutional processes that were not designed to handle the extraordinary. What I find myself thinking, in the quiet that follows all of this, is about the nature of knowledge itself. About what it means to know something, and what it means to be kept from knowing it. Most of what most people know about the world they live in, they know through mediation, through reports and documents and statements by institutions and individuals they trust enough to rely on. Direct knowledge, the kind that comes from being in a place and seeing something with your own eyes, is rare. Most of our understanding of the world beyond our immediate physical experience is constructed from testimony. When that testimony is incomplete, we do not automatically know what is missing. We know only what we have been given. The shape of the absence is not always visible from inside it. Antarctica is a place where the testimony is demonstrably incomplete. We know this not because we can see what is missing, but because the things we can see, the anomalies, the unexplained decisions, the patterns of managed access and institutional silence, tell us that the full picture has not been offered. That is enough to say with confidence. Not what the full picture contains, but that it is larger than what has been shown. The continent is still there. It will be there for a very long time. The ice above Lake Vostok will continue to press down on that ancient water. The geothermal systems under Queen Maud Land will continue to warm the rock they have been warming since before humans existed. The satellites will continue to pass overhead. The research stations will continue to operate through winter and summer, year after year, staffed by people who sign agreements about what they will and will not say when they come home. And the treaty, that remarkable and strange document signed in 1959 by governments that agreed on almost nothing else, will continue to govern who can go there and what they can do and what they are supposed to say about it. In 2048, or whenever the review of the Madrid Protocol's extraction ban actually occurs, something will shift. The nations that have spent decades building presence and capability will have to make decisions about what they have been building toward. The world will have to pay attention to Antarctica in a way it has not had to pay attention since 1959. What that moment reveals will depend on what has been happening in the silence between now and then. And that silence, the one we have been sitting with throughout this whole long night, has been going on for a very long time already, long enough that what it contains might be significant. Long enough that the people maintaining it have had time to think carefully about what they will say when it finally ends. Long enough that the rest of us might want to start paying attention before that moment arrives. Not with alarm, not with certainty about what will be found. Just with the quiet, steady kind of attention that a place like Antarctica seems to ask for. The kind that does not rush, that does not reach for the most dramatic explanation, that is willing to sit with uncertainty for as long as the uncertainty requires. Because the silence itself is telling us something, it always has been. We have just been too far away and too warm and too comfortable in the ordinary world to listen carefully enough to hear it. Now you have. And whatever Antarctica is hiding, beneath all that ice, behind all that managed quiet, in the spaces between what is officially known and what has actually been found, it will still be there when you wake up. Patient as ice, older than anything we have built. Waiting in the dark at the bottom of the world for whatever comes next.